Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Bertram. I'm the Chief Scientist for Resilience and Food Security at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I'm delighted to be able to join with you all in kicking off your deliberations around the role and the potential of African indigenous vegetables. I'd like to start by taking a look back in my own rearview mirror and think a little bit then about what we've learned in more recent years in agriculture and food security and vegetable more broadly, and think a little bit about what the implications of the COVID crisis are for our work. And then finally, the link this back to the Food Systems Summit and looking forward. So I'm going to start by also saying that in my remarks, I won't completely parse out indigenous vegetables from vegetables more broadly, partly because there's limits to my knowledge. And I think also, though, that the forces and the interests that affect vegetables broadly affect indigenous vegetables at the same time. So they're not completely separable. Also, I think that maybe part of your challenge this week is to really discern those special opportunities and the unique advantages or challenges associated with indigenous vegetables in Africa. I first became involved with these crops back in the 1990s, partly through my knowledge of and work with AVRDC, the World Vegetable Center, and its tremendous gene bank, which is at the time had something like 70,000 accessions. And I remember being amazed by the number of vegetable crops there were, for which maybe there were not huge numbers of accessions, but nevertheless, some amount of species diversity or diversity within a species were held there. One of the challenges, and this is true of indigenous vegetables as well, with vegetables generally, is the fact that there are so many of them. So often it's challenging for decision makers and policymakers to know where to engage. But I think in the case of African indigenous vegetables, we have had a number, really decades now, of experience that can really feed into the thinking that you'll be drawing on this week. And I'd say that as we got into this century, interest in both World Veg and the CGIAR grew around African indigenous vegetables. USAID and other donors, I recall the Dutch, the Germans, in the Latin American context, the Swiss, saw indigenous crops as potential opportunities, especially for smallholders and most especially, I think, for women smallholders. So in partnership with the World Veg Center and under the leadership of my colleague, John Bowman, we invested in a number of things to help strengthen the potential and the interest and investment in African indigenous vegetables. This was based out of work in Arusha, but I recall that one of the things that grew out of that was a seed company that worked on things like cleome or spider plant, African eggplant, and several other species. There was collection and conservation of diversity, sometimes analysis and screening. I think in some situations there was genetic improvement, but in some situations that basically was trying to pick out the best individuals in what were perhaps essentially wild plants. So a range of things to strengthen the position of producers to be able to supply in a reliable way growing urban demand. And strengthening the market linkages were key to all the efforts around the African indigenous vegetables. Now, after the 2007 and 2008 food price crisis, the interest in agriculture returned in a big way on the development stage. I'm sure many of you recall this, but it had this time a stronger nutrition dimension alongside hunger and poverty. So much of the focus was actually on productivity of staples and to some degree livestock. And for a number of reasons, vegetables continue to struggle for greater attention in terms of research investments. Now, if I look at Feed the Future, the US government initiative in global food security, they began under President Obama, and which continues now in its third administration. The missions in Africa were more open to investing in horticulture. Having said that, I don't know to what degree indigenous vegetables figured prominently in those. I think there was generally focused on things like tomatoes and cucumbers, and all of which, were in strong demand. There's good reasons to invest in those, but I think potentially there was space for some inclusion of a more diverse set of crops. But now 10 years into Feed the Future, or even more, 11 years, and with a heightened development in food and agriculture again, this time as a result of the COVID crisis, I think there's going to be a resetting of the agenda again. And there's an opportunity here, I believe, for your community, this community, to think about how vegetables in general, but also indigenous vegetables, diverse kinds of vegetables, can be positive drivers in food systems. And we'll come back to that a bit later. So a couple things that we learned. Diversification. We know that, a smallholder family in Africa is probably not going to escape poverty just by growing maize, even if they do everything else right. There's got to be some opportunity for some higher value crops, small livestock, some sort of diversified income source. But these are knowledge intensive crops, and more demanding production methods and innovative extension approaches are needed to go along with these kinds of perhaps new commodities for farmers to adopt them and produce them. Remember, though, that they also can be more lucrative. So that's a great incentive for people to learn how to do new things. I think on the consumer side, we also have to look, demand creation for more novel foods, something that people do think about. I think this has been particularly featured in things like orange flesh sweet potatoes or other orange maize, some of the other areas that we hear about. As I understand it, the demand for many African vegetables, though, in African cities and towns is strong. So maybe demand creation won't be one of your bigger challenges. We know that African farmers will pay for seed when it delivers value. And we've known that actually for a long time. And how do we know it? Because they're willing to pay for hybrid vegetable seed, for example. Now, much of that is imported from Asia, but we know that if we can provide a quality seed product, that's a clean product, a uniform, with high rates of germination, good viable seed, and stable genetics, that can be a big plus. The other thing we've seen is a mushrooming in the number of local seed companies, often driven by hybrid maize, but many of those same companies are interested in carrying a broader array of products. And finally, I want to mention nutrition, and this is clearly an area where vegetables can contribute. The income effects, up till now, I've been talking more about the income effects, which are also important for nutrition, very important for gender. But if we're thinking about driving broader nutrition, say amongst low-income consumers in both cities and towns and in rural areas, affordability becomes key. And affordability has to be driven by productivity gains. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean just yields. It can mean yields, but it also means reduced pre and post-harvest losses, value preservation, value addition, market efficiencies, just having more efficient trade and transport of perishable crops, which many of these vegetables are on the more perishable side, can make a huge difference. And that can be a real driver for lifting people out of poverty while making an affordable quality diet more available to low-income, nutritionally vulnerable people. The knowledge is key for both of these outcomes, both the culture on farm, but also the marketing. Think of how important marketing information is for vegetable producers. And now we have these digital tools that can be used both for providing information about pests and diseases, how to manage a crop, but also where to sell it, who's demanding it, connecting market actors, both producers and people all along the value chain. The incredible work that the East-West Seed Company did in both Asia and Africa, which won them the World Food Prize in 2019. And that had a huge knowledge and training component. So I don't want to, to underemphasize the potential, the need for investment in that, in those areas. Across all of these threads is gender. It weaves through them all. And I think it'll be very important for your community and your deliberations this week to think about how women are actors and leaders and economic agents all through this work. Finally, a few comments. New science may open up some new opportunities, potential for more rapid breeding gains, the potential to maybe accelerate, but also broaden the number of species. I mentioned the Food Systems Summit right at the beginning. I think this is an opportunity. There's a huge complexity around food systems that the whole world is thinking about as we prepare for the summit. Having points of entry, having new opportunities, these kinds of things where we can really see how we can change these in a positive way that benefits both poor people in rural areas, but also poor consumers in urban areas. These are the ones that I think will be really attractive for at least an organization like my own. And I think you all have the chance to think about that this week, of how we can try to be more intentional in driving changes in the food system that really do make these quality, nutritious foods, diverse foods, in this case, maybe more novel foods, more available and affordable in ways that everybody benefits, consumers and producers. This last point about linking rural and urban areas, I think, is another important lens to keep in view as we look at this Food Systems Summit. Finally, there is donor discussion going on around the role of vegetables broadly. I don't know yet what indigenous vegetables, what role they may or attention they may get in this, but rest assured that I think many of us who are looking at investment in agriculture, vegetables have a tremendous role to play. And my sense is that the new kinds of species are the ones that are less well known, like the ones you'll be talking about this week, have a real potential role in that space as well. So thank you all. I really wish I could be here for more of the discussions, but there is a big time difference from where I sit from where you are. But we look forward to learning about the outcomes from your deliberations this week. Thank you.